Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in from. My name is Tim Deluca-Smith. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at CoSoSys. Today's session is a product insight session looking at data protection for law firms and legal services companies. I'm joined today, delighted to be joined by Ernest Byrd, who's in a US office. Ernest is a DLP solutions engineer, so spends a lot of time working with legal services organizations and law firms, really to help them, get under the skin of data protection and DLP and protecting their most sensitive data. The purpose of these, for those of you who've joined our security briefing sessions, where it's very much an open discussion, thought leadership based content, the purpose of these product insight sessions is actually really to give you a bit of a deep dive into the product. So we'll actually be running through a product demo where Ernest will take us through some of the common challenges, policies, configurations, and how law firms think about data protection and how tools like Endpoint Protector can solve some of those challenges. I think before I pass over to Ernest, I just wanted to set this up, and I think it's important to say that as a customer base, we've seen a growing number of law firms and legal services firms becoming customers, particularly since the pandemic and the shift to hybrid working, where organizations like yours are really scrambling to understand that new security paradigm where users and employees aren't necessarily protected by those corporate networks. And I think, fundamentally, cybersecurity has, become an issue that impacts all law firms, all legal services firms. Both firms and their clients want that reassurance that their data, their most sensitive data, is protected. And I know, Ernest, I'm going to pass over to you shortly, but I know, you've been looking at, some of the sort of regulations around the industries, and certainly what organizations like the ABA have to say about protecting data. But I actually pulled out, I've got it on my screen here. I think the ABA last year, actually 2020, so a year and a half or so ago, I think 29% of all law firms experienced a data breach in 2020. Right, so this is becoming a very prevalent issue, and I think most importantly, when we often think about data protection, we often think about external forces trying to hack our networks. But actually, again, another great stat from Info Security magazine: 70% of all of those security incidents that were reported to regulators were actually caused by the employees themselves. Not necessarily malicious employees, but just general negligence and a misunderstanding of how to handle that most sensitive data. So Ernest, let me pass over to you. I mean, before we jump into your demo, perhaps you could just give us your own thoughts.
Yeah, so I think you made a great point there, Tim. Specifically, the pandemic itself brought a lot of shift into this industry. We saw, an increase in the utilization of Microsoft Teams. And in addition to that, seeing more around portable storage devices and kind of the adoption or further adoption of encrypting those storage devices. I think the overall fact is law firms, they store and have access to massive amounts of sensitive data. And so as we're seeing the rapid expansion of data and privacy regulations through local, state, and federal laws, it brings another layer of compliance exposure for law firms. So we have to think about what is important, what kind of regulatory information do law firms need to be focusing on? And quite often we find financial data is one of the things that need to be focused on, but also regulatory data. And it's regulatory data of the customers that law firms are supporting and serving. So naturally, the more jurisdictions a law firm is operating in, the greater the challenge of staying compliant becomes. What we've seen here over the past year or two is, again, the pandemic has brought a lot of dynamics into this. So more a shift in industry is coming about. One of the good resources that I've seen out there that breaks down a good focus strategy on DLP and whole is the ABA Cybersecurity Handbook. And some of the key points that relate directly to a DLP solution stack are called out here, and I'll just make mention of those first few, I think, that are most important. One, inventory your hardware and your applications. Understand what's being used in the given environment, and that really maps into what produces the risk to the organization. Additional to that, protecting sensitive data and avoiding portable media. To protect the sensitive data, you have to know what is sensitive first. So as I made mention, the financial data or the customers that you're serving, those are important to understand. Then what are the relative policies that you want to enforce? And when it gets into avoiding portable media, there might be times that a practice is not able to do away with USB storage devices altogether, but what can be done is add additional layers of protection around that. And that is the enforced encryption strategy. If you're going to have USB storage media used, which we still see is very common, encrypt that, making it where it's going to be harder to obtain that information if that device were to be lost, stolen, misplaced. Then further to that, identify and audit data and related obligations. What you can do is you can deliver what would be a more thorough analysis in a given environment. We have a solution that solves for that. We'll talk about that. This is e-discovery, being able to find data at rest versus the data in motion, which we'll also be talking about. And based on finding it at rest, you get a broader determination of that information. It allows, again, for a complement and a proactive strategy to then ensure proper access, permission review, and also support any data lifecycle requirements that you have. Further, establish cybersecurity and acceptable use policies. What are the policies that need to be enforced as an organization? And then what are the security policies that need to be enforced? How are those? Defining that early on is going to help to show responsible management around your content, which gets into the later point, which is considering cyber insurance. Cyber insurance, now it's looking at having a proof of responsible management around your sensitive and regulatory data. And so by having all of these things together, having a proper strategy in place, you're going to be more effective when it comes to a DLP solution being implemented in your given environment. And you're reducing overall the amount of financial risk for a specific attempt to compromise the data that's being had in the environment. So some of that is, again, daily, weekly conversations I'm having. But what I'd like to do, Tim, is kind of turn it back over to the product, maybe dig in and take a look at the product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should do that. And I think it's, one of the interesting things, we work with a number of different regulated industries. So whether that be pharmaceutical manufacturers, financial services organizations, I think one of the interesting things as well, certainly from the legal perspective, is it's an industry that's still quite heavily reliant on things like portable storage, USB sticks, and also printing. Right. And I think these are all of the things that we have to factor in when we think about data leakage. It's not just the digital, it can also be printed versions. So I'm going to hand over to your screen and let's run the demo.
Today, we're going to talk about how Endpoint Protector by CoSoSys solves for the challenges faced by law firms as the ever-evolving cyber threat landscape continues. I'm going to begin by logging into the Endpoint Protector Management Console. One of the first things you'll notice is when you log into the Management Console, there's going to be more of an executive overview type presence under the dashboard. Here, you're able to see the devices that are under management, any given trends or patterns that are found with your given users, as well as exit points. We'll talk about that more in depth as we get into the individual modules. And then also we'll be breaking down the modules and the levels of relevancy, where we'll talk about device control, content-aware protection, e-discovery, and finally enforced encryption. And then how all of those can serve and support regulatory challenges, needs today, again, for law firms. Let's take a look here at device control. And that's really the core of what DLP offers through here, this interface, and more specifically, the given device streams that can be managed.
So here are things like USB storage device, all the way into additional keyboards, USB modems, chip card devices. We also offer the ability for individual mobile devices to have levels of control. More, we'll see custom classes where you have the ability to create your own custom class. And under this custom class, you'll be able to define the unique entry points, the PID and the VID, or more specifically, vendor identification and the product identification. When we look at device control can be implemented in a few different ways. You can do it at a more global level. In addition to that, you can do this at a group level. And if you want to be more specific or granular, let's say a unique user or computer needs to have an explicit control policy. What you're able to do is you're able to define it at a lower level where the most restrictive takes precedence. Now, generally what we find is device control will be used in combination with our content-aware protection solution. And what is content-aware protection? Content-aware protection is more thought of as active protection within our solution stack. What that means is you're able to understand objects in motion, determine whether or not it's sensitive, and then based on that, set given restrictions. What we're going to do is take a look at one of the inbuilt policies here that I'm utilizing today, and more specifically the setting here that is configured, which is now block and remediate. What that means is in this setting, I'm going to be able to, based on my exit point strategy and my denial list strategy, be able to restrict information from going out, but also introduce one of our premium features, which is our user remediation feature. This takes some of the burden off of administrative resources in that they're not having to go in and implement the bypass for a time period for specific transactions to occur. It allows for further fine tuning and reporting, but also allows for the transaction to occur if need be. Other options introduced is blocking solely or blocking and reporting. What you'll also see is we offer thresholds, meaning if you want to, instead of restricting on a first occurrence, let's say we're talking about a larger list of file objects, what you can do is at the occurrence of maybe 5 or 10 of those objects, then do the restriction, then do the reporting, and that's when you treat it as more sensitive. The application exit points that we offer allow you to focus on major web browsers, major email clients, even instant messaging utilities. Again, going back for some time, cloud services. So file transfer utilities, Dropbox as a given example, OneDrive. You'll see that we offer the ability to restrict at those individual levels, and then even social media. Next, you'll see alongside of applications, which I like to think of as our soft exit points, being that they're software focused. We also offer more the hard exit points, the physical storage devices, being able to restrict transfer to a physical storage device based on it being sensitive. Clipboard restrictions even exist today, so that if you want to restrict clipboard functionality, the copy and paste functionality, you can do so. And this will help you to focus on, if you choose all monitored applications, the applications that are and the storage devices focused on in the exit point strategy altogether. But then you can even extend on that and choose individual applications in a list defined below. Further to that, you have the ability to restrict network sharing. And if you want to treat items as sensitive where they're not able to go out through a network share, you can do so with checking a box or restricting the print screen functionality. And even more, printers. So if you want to treat sensitive data where it is only allowed to be sent out to given applications, what you might do is define an exit point strategy and map that to a group or a larger body where you can do that at a global or more organization mapping. Moving down a little bit more, you'll notice our denial list and our denial list options. Denial list really helps you to determine if you want to block things at a file level. You'll notice we have a gamut of individual files that can be restricted, but also these different file types that can be restricted upon can also be serving the predefined content. Now, our predefined content, you'll see we have different object types: credit cards, PII, address information, social security, and it's rather extensive. But we also, to make best use of these objects, offer some of the inbuilt content aware policies. What that means is you'll be able to create a predefined policy. And for your Windows systems, your Mac systems, and Linux systems, now you have the ability to go in and focus on objects like file types, HIPAA, PCI DSS, PII, and even GDPR, which extends in the different regions. So it's broken down into different operating regions. And then more specifically, the larger amount of jurisdictions that are being served from a law firm perspective, that increases the amount of these potentially the regulations that need to be supported and served for. So by having multiple built-in, it reduces the amount of checks that you need to go through in the initial setup, making it very easy and straightforward. Further to that, when you have environments that are not only Windows based or Mac based, it's often important to really understand that Endpoint Protector serves for 0-day support. And what I mean by that is, as a new release of Mac comes out, Big Sur, when that did come out, or even when we get into Monterey, that 0-day support allows you to have no gaps in your DLP strategy. So as you have that new release come about, you're able to then take advantage of the new instance of the agent, so that, again, you're able to keep up with any security fixes and things provided from a vendor level. We also have good parity alignment between the Windows, Mac, Linux. Now, while there are variants that are different within each of these environments, we account for that. However, you're not going to have a reduced feature set, which is important to note. Now, back into the content aware policy itself, what we have is the ability to focus on, one, the exit point strategy, which are where these individual sensitive items can be transmitted through, but also what is important, what is deemed sensitive. So you can focus on file types, you can also focus on source code, all the way down into regular expression. So as you move further to the right, think of that as being more granular. What that means is, when you want to have a broken down formula, when you're looking for patterns and the like, you're able to account for that within this solution stack. And so we're going to look at a couple key examples of a pre-built content aware policy and what is deemed sensitive for this given environment. And then also you'll notice that you can define the mapping at the bottom of the policy, as well as in your content aware policy view here, where you define priorities. You define what specific endpoints or groups this policy will affiliate with. You'll also be able to see whether it's a Mac-based policy or Windows-based policy. So going into a given policy right now, we're going to look at one that I have constructed. And what I want to do is I want to focus on transmitting first what would be deemed sensitive. This is going to be a file that I've set up as really financial data. And this financial data can be credit card numbers. So if I'm going to send out an email and I want to send this out to another personal account, let's say I'm looking to take this in a rogue action set, what I would then do is attach the file. Now, here I have pre-constructed this as a sample file. So this is sample data. And when I choose this, I'm putting in some financial information. Now, the keyword itself is not where I've put the restriction. What you'll notice, though, is it's locating this and it's blocking that. Now, if I simply cancel this action, then that's going to allow me to, as an admin, still see that that action had occurred. So I'm going to discard this as a user. I think that now that's not really been accounted for. But again, it's important to know if this is a malicious action from one of your employees. Also, it's important to consider that this could be potentially a system that had a bad actor scenario. Let's say one of your antivirus products or another one of your security layers did not properly restrict the inbound access from a given, again, bad user. In this case, now you prevented that, what would be like a breach type scenario. So here you'll see this in the report that that action was caught. Another action that I want to focus on here, we'll go through one of the web ports. So I have pulled up my Dropbox account. Let's say in this given scenario, I'm again going to transfer something sensitive. Now in this case, I'm going to, as a user, attempt to upload what would be a large file list for an organization. So in this, I'm going to upload a file, and from my desktop right now, I've saved a large customer file list. So I'm going to choose to open that. Immediately, I get a restriction. I'm going to cancel that. Minimizing this again back to an admin focus. This reports the object as occurring. So I'm going to shift over to this content aware report. You'll see this is rather immediate that this will log it. That large customer item was caught, and it shows the actual matched item, which in this case was a large customer rule I had created. So going over to a denial list, what I'm able to do is pre-construct this custom content. Here, if I define a client list where I'm defining the entries that would be found within the client list, I'm able to, in this, bring all of this into a format so that it can be parsed, identifying if it matches any of this. Now it would have that same scenario, my large customer file list. Getting in a little bit more, I can do things by file name. I can also, as mentioned, regular expression. So in this given scenario, what I've done is I've created something where I've inbuilt a format for the file naming alone. So here it's client, customer, large clients, large customers, and I can extend on that with different patterns. I can do the like in determining if I'm dealing with valid email addresses. I can look at format and syntax. The main point is, so content-aware protection allows you to have the active motion detection on a large, broad array of different paths that information could be transmitted through, and you're going to have the real-time restrictions, the real-time actioning, which is important because not only is that going to help stop and reduce breach scenarios, it reduces fines, and then that gets more into cyber insurance. A lot of the cyber insurance that is had today has evolved to a path where, as an organization, you need to support due diligence. What that means is you need to have a tool in place like this today that's going to be able to actively restrict and not provide a responsive solution in the arrears type scenario once the issues occurred, but more being proactive. So stopping it in motion and then having the checks and balances, the auditing aspect. So this goes back into that resource I'd mentioned earlier, ABA, the Cybersecurity Handbook. It talks about identifying and auditing data and related obligations, the consideration of cybersecurity insurance, and then establishing cybersecurity and acceptable use policies. This helps to get into everything that you need to have defined early on before an audit scenario or breach scenario. If that were to ever come up, you're able to provide that information early on. Here's the litigation pass. Here's additionally the vision on specifically what is important to us as a firm. Now getting back into specifically e-discovery, I'd mentioned earlier that law firms store and have access to massive amounts of sensitive data. What this means is there's going to be a broader storage that needs to be accounted for, where you're going in and determining what's sensitive. This is where e-discovery comes into play, where you're able to set up scans. Think of this as more of a passive scanner or a full scanner. This would allow you to, in a given scenario, define a very similar to content-aware protection, a policy that's deeming information as sensitive. And then following that, what you're able to do is trigger these scans to be run in either a manual sequence or a recurring sequence. Now, being a broader scan type, it is important to consider that you want to have this not running during your prime working hours what you might do is you might define this to run once a week or once a month. But once you have your scan results, it's going to deliver any specific risk items within to your scan results and actions view so that you can either encrypt or delete that information set. The main driver in this is remove specific risk that you're not responsible for. Also, by detecting that information presence earlier on, it takes some of the burden off of your active protection. Here I do make mention that it's important to run this during your non-prime working hours. You might put this, like I used to do as a consultant, in antivirus scans. When I ran a full scan, I might do once every Wednesday to have an incremental type scan. So we do have options to do incremental scans and what would be a complete full scan. What you might do is run a full scan once a month. Incremental might be less frequent. But the thought is when you have a larger data store, hundreds of gigabytes or terabytes, that's where you want to stagger these. So the device control gives you that first device level inventory understanding of what is connecting to your endpoints. It also then allows you to support some of the device layers under the active scanning capability. E-discovery then using that as a support for your active scanning, where it's a very similar setup, but a broader understanding of that data type. And then we get into enforced encryption. So although there would be a recommendation to avoid portable media, that's not always available as an option. So what you can do is you can better protect your portable media. And the options here are simply encrypt that. What we offer is 256 AES encryption, where you can take a USB storage device and you can put an isolated storage chamber on the device. To enforce that under device control, what you can do is use the +1 trusted model. And what that'll do is introduce our encryption strategy. We also offer other options here in terms of other encryption solutions that we can, in a sense, integrate with. And what that means is you can go in and put the other trusted level that's defined in our user manual for the encryption solution you're using today. But in essence, if you utilize our enforced encryption strategy, you would have a user-defined password that would allow access to that encryption chamber. You can, in addition, require the presence of the agent in order to have access and present that password. In further review, you'll see other security layers where you can enforce password links when the user first sets up access. And then you can have a self-destruct feature set. So if it is, let's say, a set amount of failed access attempts, that data would no longer be accessible. So what this allows you to do is you take your USB storage devices. Now what you can do for your employees is specifically when they're in transit, train, plane, automobile, if that were to be a device stolen, lost, or misplaced, that data would not get into the wrong hands. And so with options like here, requiring the agent's presence, now you're saying even that device getting into the wrong hands, they're not going to be able to do what would be like a brute force attack, essentially, to be able to get into that data. And then further, what you'll see is there's actions that can be utilized here to, if a user forgets a password, force a reset or resend a master password if you need to, from an admin perspective, help support access. But then you can do what would be a wipe scenario if need be as well, if that were to be a misplaced item. Now, digging into more of the advanced options in the administration, we took a look at the admin capabilities, some of the reporting here. We also offer what would be log reporting. Now, this would give you the ability to see what kind of activities occurring at an endpoint level. File tracing gives us the ability to understand more specifically what kind of files are being utilized in terms of an audit trail, how that's being utilized. And then further, file shadowing is a good complement to understand that the files transmitted from users may perhaps have that again, sensitive information. But when you look at it in the report, it would be obfuscated. Instead of requesting it from a user, which you can have as a holding repository to be able to, as an admin, go in and review this information and then see what kind of content exists within. Admin actions, being able to understand what's occurring in terms of policy changes, report generations, etc. This goes back into the checks and balances. By having this vision here at the dashboard level, it's important to be able to have an audit path. Alerts, we offer the ability for specific alerts for each of the modules to be generated. So if you want an email notification alongside of reports, you're able to have the notification with certain incidents. So if you had an employee put in a 2 weeks notice, perhaps you implement an alert and heighten monitoring on that specific user. For user level controls, we offer integrations with Active Directory as well as Azure, meaning you can have users predefined and you can bring in those security groups so that you at a group level can impose your restrictions. And then more you'll see for your admins within this solution, you can define what levels of access they would have. Roles and permissions would be a good terminology for this. You can introduce single sign-on, so taking advantage of your single sign-on utilities for your administrators so that they have an additional layer of security. And then further to that, within, you'll see that we offer things like two-factor or multi-factor authentication options. And then lastly, just general appliance management. Being that this is offered in a hosted manner from our organization, but in addition, you can have it virtualized on-prem or in your own cloud solution, meaning you can in GCP, Azure, or Amazon spin up Endpoint Protector and then manage your endpoints directly from that interface. Now, this is where you would achieve the application download. So I did make mention that we have 0-day offerings, Mac, Windows specifically. By simply downloading this, you can deploy out the agent through your utility, whether it be for Mac, Jamf is a common deployment solution, or on the Windows side, something like Active Directory or SCCM, or even a remote management utility that you might be using today. This is going to give you the ability to deliver your agents, and then once the agents deliver, the policies taken from this dashboard in terms of how you've configured it to be used and deployed. And then going forward to manage new updates, you can do this all directly within this management console. So this is primarily thought of as the agents to hook to the system. The 4 agent modules that are available here are the device control, content aware protection, e-discovery, and enforced encryption. And then a lot of the management functions that are necessary for an enterprise scale DLP solution is all found within.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that, Ernest. I did forget at the very start of this. I've done enough webinars to feel ashamed that I forgot my housekeeping and told everybody that there is a Q&A in this, but I didn't want to interrupt the demo. A couple of folks did find the Q&A button for themselves, which is fantastic. Thank you. We'll cover those while we answer. I have them here. While we answer some of those questions, do feel free to use it, everybody. The Q&A, if you're familiar with a regular Zoom meeting, you'll find it down the bottom. But let me touch on a couple of these, because there were a few sort of groupings as we were going through. I was kind of grouping some of the questions together. So there was a couple of questions about the use of services like Microsoft Teams and Slack. I think like our own organization, as we moved into that sort of hybrid work mode, our reliance on enterprise collaboration apps increased massively. And I think, certainly for law firms, a lot of them are Microsoft Teams users, certainly in my experience. So there's a question around protection of sharing. I think you gave the example in the demo of moving something to OneDrive or using email, but how does that same protection work if I'm trying to share that same file? I think you had that large customer list, for example, if I was trying to share that on Teams.
Yeah, so it would be no different than any other exit point. We can capture all the major messaging applications, specifically enterprise grade messaging tools. And with that, it would be just like the browsers, mail clients, et cetera, that we offer as exit points. So generally, you're not going to have any loss in vision. If anything, by using our solution, you're going to get an increase in the vision and understanding of that transmit of content and what the potential exit attempts look like today.
Got it. Got it. Now, I mentioned before the demo as well, the use of USB storage devices, removable storage devices. And I think as you touched on, I think for a lot of organizations, it's just a blanket, let's shut that down, right? That's just not permitted. But I get in some industries, certainly in the legal sector, their use is still prevalent. When people are at the courthouse or just traveling. I know a lot of people are using pre-encrypted hardware, encryption on those USB devices. I think one of the brands that came up, these Apricorn USB sticks. I think you mentioned that we can actually work with those, but maybe you could just sort of clarify that point, because the question is whether we support those types of products.
Yeah, so although we do offer our own enforced encryption, we also do support other third-party encryption methods on USB storage devices. So simply just changing to the appropriate trusted level under device control would be appropriate for working alongside of that.
So I think then what we're saying as well is there's actually with a solution like Endpoint Protector, there's no need to rely on those encrypted devices. So that encryption can happen at a software layer, right, through Endpoint Protector. I'm guessing we can actually put our own encryption onto a standard USB drive if that was the approach as well.
Well, yeah, in the sense that a third-party encryption is already put in place on a storage device, all we're doing is saying to ensure that that's the case. If a device were to be attached without that setting in place, then it would not allow access.
Great, perfect. You mentioned around being able to spin this up in your own cloud environments or through an appliance. Maybe you could just cover that again in a bit more detail, because there was a couple of questions about whether this was a cloud-based solution. So I guess the questions around the different deployment options that organizations would have.
Yeah, so we do offer a SaaS-based model, which would be where we provide the infrastructure, the stack, and then you manage the product. We do also offer in major cloud platforms an option. So again, GCP, Azure, or Amazon, AWS specifically. And then the on-prem options. Some of our customers do require on-prem. So Hyper-V, VMware, or other virtualization platforms are options as well. So really three main options around where the server stack can be delivered.
Perfect. Great question here. And I think this really ties back to, there are different types of DLP, right? We'll talk about cloud DLP or network DLP or endpoint DLP. And there's this question here about what happens if a laptop goes offline, right? How can you maintain protection? And I think that really talks to the strength of endpoint DLP, right? The policies will still offer protection and management. Okay, you may not get the reporting back until that device reconnects to a network, but it's still maintaining whatever policy was applied before that device went offline. It's still able to apply that policy, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I think again you just hit the nail on the head. When a device is offline, when it's not able to communicate with the server, you still have the endpoint protection. So that's a key benefit of having an endpoint level solution versus relying on an upstream server to then disseminate policy, meaning you would have a gap in coverage. I think that's a really interesting one. When you do have a workforce that is, not always office based, they are out and about, they're continuing to work, they may not have, I know certainly in some courthouses, there's just no Wi-Fi connections, right? It's just not available. So they're working offline, they're using USB storage devices, are having that ability to maintain protection, I think is pretty important. There's a question about our ability to cover encrypted data as it passes through. Are we able to comment on that, Ernest? Yeah, so in terms of encryption itself, I did mention encryption options directly under e-discovery and then enforced encryption, two separate encryption paths, if you would. But if it's about encrypted data on USB storage devices, then specifically what you'd be able to do if you're using our enforced encryption is you would be able to decrypt that content by providing a password that's defined during first setup and a utility that's going to allow you access to that. That is the Easy Lock utility. So that is one specific speak around encrypted data. Now, the other piece is e-discovery itself. If you do a encryption on determined sensitive data, you can decrypt it from the dashboard as an admin to be able to allow access again. So those are the two paths into encryption specifically, where it's focused at more a content level versus an entire platform level.
Got it. Okay. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know for some of the folks who've joined, it's actually the morning. Despite the darkness out of my window, it's evening time for me, but I know some of you are still in your working day, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I want to thank you, Ernest. Thanks for making the time to join us today and giving us that demo. That was really interesting. Do keep an eye out at endpointprotector.com for new webinars that are coming up. We'll obviously be sharing a copy of this recording with everybody as well.
And I had a quick question that came in on OCR.
Oh, right.
So yes,
yeah, okay. I see
we
it.
do offer OCR level support and metadata scanning as well. So
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that was attended to. Sorry about that.
Perfect. No, listen, if anybody does have any more questions, but didn't have the chance to drop them in the Q&A, when we send out the recordings, you'll have our email addresses. So you're welcome to get in touch directly. But don't forget to visit endpointprotector.com for more. And for the time being, thank you everybody for making time to join us today. And with that, I'm going to close out today's webinar. Thank you, Ernest.
Thank you.